Hello, I'm Brett Knowles from the Risk Scorecard Network. In this YouTube, I'm going to quickly walk you through some of the common definitions, terms, and concepts we use when talking about risk. So, first off, we need to understand about business and risks. So, depending on what business you choose to be in, different risks will begin to emerge, whether I'm running a car rental agency, a trucking company, or an ambulance service. Now, all those industries may have a cluster of similar risks. And what defines the risks that your organization needs to focus on really is the strategy. So this is sort of a balancing act. And as we put more weight on a particular strategy, let's say running an ambulance service, specific risks increase. So the ambulance service probably has higher risks around things like making sure that the vehicle goes to the right location, that it gets there on time, that the dispatch process works particularly well, and so forth. And those risks are shared with the trucking agency and the car rental agency, but they're accelerated or increased because of the strategy around ambulance services. In fact, if we begin to take a look at those risks, that cluster of risks on the right are what we call the risk universe. The risk universe is the long list of all possible risks that your organization might undergo. Now, this obviously isn't an ambulance services risk universe. It's just a few sample ones, but the total collection of them is the risk universe. Within the risk universe are the specific risks, or what we call the risk elements. So a risk element is an individual thing like reputation, dispatch, on time. And you've got to decide how to define those and how specific you want to be. Then finally, to help us understand systemic issues, we often try to categorize risks into similar groupings. And there are a number of groupings out there. If you take a look at your industry, chances are there's industry or function-specific risks, or you can go to risk frameworks like COSO and ISO 31000. The net is we've got a series of categories. So in this case, I'll use an example, say logistics, and some of those risk elements fit into that category. Now, there's reasons to set up categories in terms of, as I described, understanding systemic or common themes between them, and there's reasons not to. The reasons not to include the fact that it adds an extra dimension, and if it doesn't help management make a better decision, then there's no value in going through that step. The other thing to note is risk elements often fit into multiple categories, and sometimes that's confusing. So in this example, something like a dispatch might be a risk inside logistics, but it might also be a risk inside of technology because the systems could go down, or even human capital because it could be a training issue. So the categorization has some uses, but it's kind of a two-edged sword. Now, let's take a specific risk. So an example might be, what's the risk of that ambulance having an accident on the way to a site? We're going to describe that in two aspects. One, likelihood. What is the probability that we would have that accident? And I've underlined probability because some organizations call this probability, other organizations call it likelihood. Kind of the same thing. The second dimension we look at is impact. If we had an accident, what would be the consequences of that accident? And again, I've underlined consequences because some organizations call this consequences, others call it impact. Kind of the same thing. So, likelihood and impact. Now, it turns out that we need to mitigate those risks. So in the likelihood category, the question is, what controls or actions can we take that would reduce the likelihood of that accident occurring? And that might be things like we're going to train the driver. Maybe we're going to have a better vehicle. We're going to, have ABS brakes, fresh tires, better mechanicals, whatever. Maybe it's public awareness. Let people know what they're supposed to do when they hear a siren or see an ambulance. And then finally, laying down driving guidelines and policies to make sure the driver doesn't find themselves in a risky situation. And then we'll embellish that through the training and public awareness. So, mitigation strategies. Likewise, we can also mitigate the impact. In other words, if we had an accident, what could we do? What actions could we take to reduce the impact of that accident? mitigation in the impact area in this example are things like wearing seat belts, installing airbags, or building the ambulance in a more sturdy fashion so that the people inside of it aren't injured in the accident. And again, there are many mitigation strategies that impact likelihood and others that impact and some that do both. So we describe likelihood and impact, and then we talk about mitigation strategies in both categories. Now, the final thing that I want to touch on is how it is we score these risks. And we'll talk about scoring frameworks in other webinars, but what I'm concerned about here is when we score, we need to look at it under two dimensions. One is what's called the inherent risk. In other words, what is the likelihood and impact if the organization did nothing to reduce that risk, likelihood, or impact? And then a second evaluation is residual risk. Residual risk is a risk that's left over after you take all those actions and so on. And you can choose whether you're going to score residual based on the current situation or residual after the recommended changes that you have in place for the current planning period. So that's a collection of concepts. Now, each of those has obviously an awful lot more detail behind it. And if you want to learn more, please join us at riskscorecard.net.